and
Yeah. Hopefully, can you see the warrior in the background? Is that?
Yeah, very well, actually.
Awesome.
good.
Awesome. Well, hi Don.
Hi.
So if you to start, just kind of explain your background, introduce yourself a little bit.
Okay. My name is Dawn Sherry-Tomei, and I'm the curator of the anthropology collections at the Milwaukee Public Museum. I've been here 30 years and entirely in the anthropology department, and I oversee and interpret over 400,000 objects and related exhibits here at the museum.
What kind of inspired you to get into this kind of career path?
Well, when I was young, I read a book that inspired me on Pompeii, which I think many people might have heard about, but it was a village, it was a city that was destroyed by volcanoes and perfectly preserved in Italy in AD 79. So I was really fascinated by that, so I started reading a lot about archaeology and classical civilizations, and so that was, it didn't really shift too much. So I went on to Beloit College for my undergrad in anthropology and museum studies, and then went to graduate school at UWM.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm pretty sure a lot of us have heard of actually the Pompeii city that it's really popular in the history books. That's really cool. That's where you kind of found your inspiration to come here.
Yeah.
And so how long have you been at the Milwaukee Public Museum?
Well, I've been here 30 years, which is also just strange to say because I think when you love what you do, it just goes by very quickly. So it hasn't been the same job. I always thought if I ever got bored that I would leave, and I haven't really had that opportunity to be bored. There's always something new to work on, something new that you learn basically every day.
And so let's talk about this weapons exhibit that we are
we're in the midst
right
of,
now.
right?
Yeah, this is really cool. I've had the opportunity to kind of visit and tour this a couple times, and I'm just really in awe about just all these weapons and all these really cool artifacts that kind of point towards what life was like back then. So just talk about everything that went into making this exhibit happen and come to life.
Okay. Well, I was asked to develop an exhibit in October of 2015 because we had a change in our exhibit schedule, and so our president really wanted an exhibit that highlighted our own collections because we've been renting a lot of exhibits, and they come from all over the country. And there's nothing wrong with that, but he wanted to mix it up. So, and just to recognize that we have just a vast collection with great scope and depth and quality, over 4 million objects. So we don't have galleries that are very flexible oftentimes, where you can update things easily. So I proposed 2 ideas, and this was the one I really was very interested in. I wanted to develop something that was a bit more thought-provoking, a little bit more edgy than what we had before. And so as far as weapons are concerned, I was fascinated by the type of material itself because I felt that they were very powerful objects without a lot of explanation in a sense too. And that these are some of the things that really shaped and defined history in a way that I don't think people think about. They think about weapons and battle and standing armies and mostly European and American endeavors, which makes sense because it's really what we're most familiar with. But this exhibit covers over 50 countries and dates from over 10,000 years ago to today.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's quite, yes it is. I keep thinking, I look at it and it's very funny during the installation, that it's actually coming to fruition. What was in your head for so long, and then on some paper, and then working with really talented individuals, that help you realize this in the physical sense. And I had a lot of wonderful interns from many different schools, but including Marquette, that helped me with research. So that was very beneficial.
Yeah, yeah. And I've walked around this exhibit and I've seen just how much information is on each kind of slab. So talk about that a little bit and why and how unique this is.
Well, it's unique. The exhibit is unique for several reasons. Well, one of them is that we are going across time, ethnographically and historically, and it's, for example, a lot of military museums have only very modern warfare items, and then art museums like the Art Institute of Chicago have weapons as an aesthetic. But looking at really how weapons developed and the cross-cultural influences and the idea of the many meanings of weapons, that's the first. So no museum has looked at it quite in this conceptual way of looking at, including and beyond the offensive and defensive purposes of weapons, but looking at weapons as objects of identity, looking at them as symbolic or ritual, looking at weapons in art and weapons as art. All of these things are in the exhibit. So another thing I think that's unusual is that, through my research, I'm the first female curator of a weapons exhibit, a major weapons exhibit. And again, that was not a motivation. I don't think of gender that way. As you're creating an exhibit, sort of sub-themes evolve, in different ways. The labels themselves are different because one of the things I did was ignore some standard rules in the development, because I teach exhibits. Yes, I teach an exhibit course. And so, they're saying that there's certain things I kept to, obviously, but they said, keep every label between this length and that length, so I ignored most of the time the length of the labels, and what I did was I decreased the introductory aspects, and some don't even have an introduction. It just says Japanese armor, and then, so the labels really are written to bring out the stories of the objects, and really my thought and my interns, what I was helping them was with helping the object speak for itself, and telling its own story. And stories, we're in this age of stories and storytelling, which is very provocative and something that I've been trying to promote for years, but now it's popular. So I had this opportunity to talk about history through these really fascinating objects.
That's really cool. So there's a lot of, as mentioned, really cool artifacts in this exhibit, really cool weapons. Do you have a favorite weapon or a couple of favorites that when you were putting this together, you're like, this one has to be in the weapons exhibit? Well,
there were some things. We looked at over 3,000 weapons in our collection, including those we have over 300 on exhibit, and for long term. And so we went through 5 levels of elimination, and those were based on several different criteria. One was, the aesthetic, and it was interesting to look at, and looking at variety of types of weapons, and through time and country, and provocative stories, and emotional kind of reactions to things. So there were different things that we considered. So each, there are many that made it to the end, the 188, including some lone pieces, a few lone pieces. But I joked that when I'm in the exhibit and interacting with folks, I come in 2 to 3 times a week just to be with people to extend the stories. And I joke that my favorite weapons are the one, it's the one that I'm standing next to at that moment, because everything is fascinating for different reasons. It might be its emotional impact, or its craftsmanship, or it could be the story. But there's some things that really resonate with a lot of people coming through, which it's also interesting to see there isn't one overwhelming object, which I was hoping for, that people were very attracted, and we did some testing before just to see what their thoughts were. But the hat pins, the ladies' hat pins, are a fascinating story, and I think that that brought out, I think, one of the women's narratives, but also made people think really what a weapon is. Walking into this exhibit, what we wanted to do is sort of change people's ideas of what a weapon is. Because, again, people walk in and going, of course, a 3-year-old knows what a weapon is. But then partly, what I really want them to leave this exhibit with is really being confounded and confused by the whole thought that it's much broader than they thought, that these objects are catalysts for storytelling or understanding history, that they can be they can be more symbolic than functional, or in an offensive way. So understanding that part, we really don't have that opportunity in the United States. Our military material is totally functional, and then you have some officers' swords that are very symbolic because we don't use them anymore. But, in other countries, these have incredibly deep meaning, to the individual, to the country, so it's very different. So the hat pins are a great example of a time period and a place, in history. And the pieces, they were used initially as decorative elements and to keep women's large hats, secured to their heads so they wouldn't blow away. So they had this function initially, and they were beautiful and decorative, like, some other women's jewelry. But, at a time when women started working outside the home unaccompanied, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and harassment grew because they were walking alone or working very early in the morning or late at night, in all sorts of areas. And they began using these hat pins for self-defense. And so other women were showing other women, how to use these as self-defense. But then because they thought it was actually really unladylike to even defend yourself. I thought that was kind of unusual. Laws were passed to restrict the length of hat pins.
Really?
Yes. So even in Milwaukee in 1913, they passed a law restricting the length of hat pins.
Because they thought that it was unladylike.
Unladylike,
to use
and that that there were some accidental ones, but more intentional use of them. And then not long after, when World War I broke out, the ladies' hat styles changed. So the use of hat pins sort of became a non-issue.
Oh, that's a great story of how something that started as a functional use of the hat pins turned into more of a defensive use for women. That's really cool.
So as a curatorial decision, initially I thought, well, should I put it in unusual weapons? Should I put it in concealed weapons? But I really felt putting it in the section in defensive was a much more powerful statement. It stood alone, and so it's just one of the things that you have to consider. All of these things, the things that keep you up at night, or all the details, in doing an exhibit.
That's really cool. So in a previous conversation we had, you talked about how the Crossroads exhibit and this weapons exhibit differed, but also shared some similarities. Can you talk more about that?
Sure. When looking at all the available artifacts you have at your disposal, so I looked at all of the objects that were on exhibit, and we narrowed down possibilities for removing objects from exhibit. for this exhibit, for a temporary one, but it's like the last thing that you want to do. So I removed probably about 8 pieces altogether, and I decided, actually as a blanket statement, not to remove any of the items from the Crossroads exhibit for this exhibit, because I felt it would be redundant in the same museum to just move them one place to another and do similar things. The stories, quite honestly, for those particular objects were not hugely provocative, so they didn't, you know, I had to have really great justification for removing the pieces. So we thought we could extend the story more powerfully by keeping those, you know, weapons and armor in place.
That's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
So talk about maybe some of the artifacts that are in the Crossroads exhibit, just more like compared to the ones that are here in the weapons exhibit.
There's a lot of material from Persia and from Luristan in particular. There are swords, there are other handheld items, and there's armor. And I also looked at some of the Greek vessels for potential use, but honestly, none of them were provocative enough to remove for this exhibit, so I chose one from the collections. So those items also, you know, were more fragile because they're very ancient. So that was another consideration for not removing the pieces. But looking at the evolution of swords is in a separate tour. We start actually with Crossroads, and talk about the evolution of the sword, looking at bronze as a material and how it's made and how it's used. And so that's, you know, really, I think, the majority of the things. I know that in the Dosen tour they talk about the 2 warriors as well and what they're wearing. And we included the King Tut figure too, and his war chariot.
Wow. So there's just a lot of different things that went into leaving some of those, you know, basically the Crossroads exhibit, the weapons in the Crossroads exhibit intact, and then just having completely new weapons here to just show how meaningful and significant, you know, these weapons that you chose for this exhibit are. That's awesome.
Well, we wanted to extend the story of those things we have on exhibit too. So it wasn't just a temporary exhibit. We wanted to be able to create information that could stay for the future. So it gave us an opportunity to focus our efforts, you know, on those other permanent exhibits like Crossroads.
That's really cool. Last question for you, Dawn.
Okay.
It's talking about kind of the expansion of digital technology
Sure.
and how museums can often be found online.
Right.
So what challenges does that bring to this exhibit and this museum when a lot of times you can do a Google search and find some artifacts online in museums that are online there?
You can, and you know, that's something that our museum is working toward, is having, you know, a digital presence for our collections. And we have certain collections online, but it's certainly not comprehensive. But what we, you know, the power of the object and the authenticity, being in the presence of, where you can almost touch the items, and in some of our educational programs, and I have my interns bringing out weapons, and some of them are touchable, different shields, different types of items. So these things are, you know, important, because the way that humans learn and the way that we process, when we see something online, when we are in the presence of, is a very different type of situation. So it's how we learn. We learn by tactile, you know, opportunities and experiences. We learn from, our brain tells us we are in the presence of a 3-dimensional object rather than a 2-dimensional object. So I think the power of museums for also these narratives, along with the objects, I think are some of the most amazing things. One of the things, questions that we received over and over again for this exhibit, in fact, are these things real? You know, that the authentic, the real is so surprising to people in a virtual world. And that there's a high degree of recreation, whether it's three-dimensional types or two-dimensional types, which you can do both of those quite easily virtually. The understanding that these pieces are part of our shared heritage, I think, is a really important factor as well. So being in the presence of is one of the most powerful things. I think also one of the things that's limiting by virtual technology is the shared social experience that museums offer. That you can be with someone else, whether it's a stranger, you know, or your family group, and share conversations and experience. And there have been so many in this exhibit. From a discussion I had on Saturday with a gentleman who thought that our Scottish broadsword was the type that was used in The Princess Bride. So bringing even then, and so explaining why that these swords were different, you know, to understanding why, you know, this suit of armor doesn't have any armor on his backside because he was a cavalry armor, but children notice like why he has no protection on his back, so because he's astride a horse. So just different types of learning opportunities, you know, with the object present, I think is actually one of the most powerful interpretive strategies that you can't get when you're viewing something on a screen.
Well, thank you so much,
Oh,
Dawn,
you're welcome.
for sitting here and chatting with me a little bit about your exhibit that you put together here at Weapons, as well as the Crossroads exhibit. I appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thanks.